I when I was at OU many years ago, many years ago, I had to go to a lectureship. Uh, it was a required deal, you had to go. So we got to choose our who we went to hear, and the guy that we chose to go listen to was Stephen King, the writer. And so Susie was with me, and so we go into this lectureship, and I'm not a huge horror fan, so he's not really like one of my favorite people on earth to read. That's not really my genre, so I don't. But anyway, we go in there, and he goes, he said, I started this. He said I started writing this book, and he said there was these people at this airport, and he said in this women's bathroom, and he said these women would go in to go to the bathroom, and he said, but they wouldn't come out, which for women that's not unusual, right? So, but he said they were sitting there for a while waiting, and he said, and pretty soon these guys would be more and more guys, waiting on their wives or whoever to come out of this bathroom, and no women were coming out. He said, finally, this one guy gets up the nerve to go in there. And as he goes in the bathroom, there's no women in there. He says, in this stall, he hears something in this stall, or this glowing in this one stall. So he says he finally works up enough nerve, and he goes in and he opens the door of the stall. And he said, but that's how come I never wrote the book, because I never could figure out what was in there. And what was in the stall, so I never could write the book. I never could figure out what was in there that was doing this. But to me, what Ron said tonight, because I've always said, and I think I've lived this, I think I'm living this, so I think I can say this with all honesty that, it's real easy to say you're a Christian, and it's real easy to say you're forgiving, and it's real easy to say this is easy, but I promise you, you never know what's going to be behind door number 3. And if you think I'm lying to you, I'm not. You never know what's going to happen in your life, and you never know how that's going to rock your faith and your belief and your idea of forgiveness. And when that happens, you just, I know exactly what Ron's saying. So I mean, I understand that exactly. It rocks you in places it affects you in ways you can't even begin to imagine. And I think you become smart. You become part of a group of people that you wished you were never a part of. You never want to be part of that group. But when you are, I don't know. Uh, I don't know. I don't know the answers. I haven't preached a sermon on forgiveness in over 2 years, and there's a reason for that. So, I think that you don't judge people, and don't judge people's hearts, because I promise you, you don't know what some people have gone through in their lives, and pray to God you never know, because you don't want to know. And how that affects you is steals your joy, steals your life. I mean, I can't begin to tell you uh, how hard it is to get through that stuff. And I just don't judge people. you know, don't judge them, because you don't know what doors they've had to walk through. And I think that's, I'll leave it at that. But I mean, I know exactly what, I know exactly. I don't know exactly how you feel, Ron. We've talked, and I can't. One thing you can never tell somebody. One thing you should never tell somebody is, I know how you feel. That's something you should never, ever, 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 ever say. I don't care the situation. I don't care if they've lost a loved one and if they've lost their mother and you've lost their mother. You do not know how anybody else feels. I do. I never know how you feel. I I can relate to you. I can have empathy for you. I can say I know some of the things, the thoughts that you're having, but you never know how somebody else feels, ever. I think that's one of the worst things you can ever tell somebody is, I know how you feel. No, you don't. You don't. Because you're not me and I'm not you. And there's no way you can know how I feel. And there's no way I can know how you feel. So, when you talk to people that have gone through tragic times in their lives, there's things you should never say. And we say them all the time. And there's things you should never, ever say as a Christian. You should never, ever say, I know how you feel, ever. You should never say, it's part of God's plan. You should never say that. That's something you should never say to somebody, because that's not true. And, you know, as Christians, those are the things I hear a lot at funerals and at places, and every time I do, I cringe, because I feel like as Christians, we should have better responses to people's pain than to say, it's okay because it's part of God's plan. That's absolutely of no use. You know, we as Christians, we should know how to respond to people in a way that makes sense. And I don't know if you read my bulletin article this week, Real Christianity, but that's something, you know, I started through that a couple of years ago, and it's just kind of a road I've gone down, and I you know, I think it explains, some of that explains part of how I feel about faith and God, but you know, brethren, you know, life can be tough, and life can make no sense. And as Christians, we want it to make sense. We want God to make it make sense. That's what we want. We want the answer. We want God to give us the answer. We want it to make some sort of sense. But I'm here to tell you that, you know, this world is flawed, and there's things that happen to you in this life that it's not going to make sense. It's never going to make sense, because we live in a very flawed world. And, you know, to look beyond that, to look beyond to the promises of God is what we have to do. To look to the hope that this isn't the end, the hope of the resurrection, the hope of the promise of Jesus Christ. You know, sometimes we're not going to know everything in the journey, and we don't need to know that. And to say, well, it's all part of God's grand plan is just not right. No, it's just a cop-out. You know, we live in a flawed world with flawed people. We live in a world that Satan rules. We live in a broken world, and the truth of Christianity is not, Christ is not about making sense of the brokenness of this world. Christ is about looking to the hope beyond this world. And when we have to do that as Christians, you know, we have to let people look towards the hope of Christ, not towards the brokenness of this world, and to say somehow brokenness makes sense, because brokenness does not make sense, doesn't. For children to die does not make sense. For people to commit suicide does not make sense. That's not God's plan. God doesn't plan to take people to kill babies. To say that's part of God's plan makes God this heinous creature that does things that's unbelievable, and you can't do that. You have to understand the hope of Christ is not about the brokenness of the world. It's about the hope of the resurrection, the hope of tomorrow, the hope of the future, the hope of heaven, the hope of eternity, the hope of glory. That's what we look towards. And that's what we should focus people towards, is that idea. You know, without Christ, there's no hope. And that's true. Without Christ, the brokenness of this world holds no hope. And, I mean, I can't tell you everything that's in my heart. I just can't, and I won't, and I haven't been able to, but I can. But when what Ron says, Ron, I mean, you touch me. I mean, I'm sitting there crying, you know, I mean, literally, you know, as I understand some of your suffering. I understand some of your paths. I do, you know, and I think it's just important for people to know that you know, it's just not easy to overcome something like this, and it takes time, and it takes love, and it takes the support of the people around you. And I think, you know, that's maybe the most important thing to get you through it, is the hope of, you know, having good people around you, you know, and having people around you that maybe you can share that with is, you know, that's really powerful in our lives. And that's one thing I think Christ gives us. He gives us this network of people that, you know, should know to understand us and should love us and should understand that, you know, some things you don't fix in a minute or a week or a month or 10 years. You just don't. You know, some things you never fix. But you learn to live with it and find joy to overcome it. And there's a lot of people in this room that have gone through terrible things. So, you know, I'm definitely not alone. You're definitely not alone. I mean, I look in this room and see people who have lost terrible tragedies, terrible. So, you know, I just think that, anyway, enough said. Just wanted to throw that out there. So, Acts 28, end of Acts, last chapter, Paul in Rome. Kind of a boring chapter in a way, but I think it gives some really good insight into first Christianity thought and first century Christianity thought, which I think is really important, and I want to think about that a little ago. This is where they had shipwrecked and they wound up on Malta, and the natives were kind, which is a little bit odd, but they were, and they made a fire. Paul was not above gathering wood here. He was gathering to help with the fire. They come from the shipwreck, come through the water. It's winter. It's cold. So they're doing that, and there's a viper, which there are no poisonous snakes on Malta today, interestingly enough. But, you know, a lot has changed in 2,000 years, and Malta's a lot more populated than it was 2,000 years ago. So there isn't any today, but apparently this viper, who apparently was poisonous, they're natives, they should know what it is, and it fastened itself on Paul's hand. Now, I'm going to tell you, this does not have anything to do with handling poisonous snakes, right? This is not that. Matter of fact, I know Brent hates me to say it. Brent's not in here, so I can say it. All the last part of Luke that talks about handling poisonous snakes is a textual variant in the Bible. Just throwing that out there. So, but this is not about it. This is one of those things where the snake comes out. Paul's not trying to get bit. He's not trying to handle the snake. It's just one of those things that God does for his glory. The point of this story, though, to me, is not so much that. You know, we know Paul's going to survive. Paul's going to go to Rome. You know, God's with Paul. Paul's an apostle. You know, but I think one thing this really gives you is something, it's insight into something that we in this century, in our present time, we have a hard time relating to Scripture because it's a real simple idea, and the idea here is cause and effect. And I think that's something we have to think about a little bit. And I think sometimes maybe we go a little too far the other way. But the point is this. You know, in the Bible was written, especially Old Testament, but New Testament too. You got to understand, those people didn't have our science, right? I mean, they didn't have that whatsoever. You know, the word for heart in the Old Testament is literally intestine. Literally, that's what it is, guts. You know, and that's not how translators translate it because they know that probably wouldn't work very good for modern day readers. But in Old Testament thought and first century thought, nothing happened up here. This thing, nothing happened in this thing. This was just, they didn't really understand this. Matter of fact, all the way up into what, the second, third century, they really didn't understand the brain. You know, they thought, you know, even through the Middle Ages, you know, they thought that the brain was just a cooling mechanism for blood, you know, like a radiator. You know, they didn't realize that we had any knowledge up here. As far as Old Testament people were concerned, all our knowledge was in here, right? I mean, we still say that today, right? You say, I got a gut feeling, right? Well, that comes from that idea, right? We don't say I got a head feeling. When it's I got a brain feeling that says I ought to do this, we said I got a gut feeling, right? Because when we get upset and we worry, where do we hurt? You know, here or here, right? You know, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you don't have the science to say, yeah, this is the thing that thinks, and you don't have any of that, and when you get upset, you're hurting down here, where do you think, right? Down here, right? In the gut. And so the Old Testament, when it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, literally in the Hebrew, it's saying, love the Lord your God with your guts. Okay, that's really what that says. Literally in the Hebrew, that's what that says, because that's what they thought. Now, I say that to say this. Their cause and effect were not like ours. And what I mean by that is we see things from a very scientific standpoint, right? In other words, if somebody today falls down on the ground here and has a seizure, what would you think? What's the first thing you think? That person has what? Epilepsy, right? We need to give that person some medication, right? Because we know that seizures are caused by something going wrong in the brain, right? And we know that that can be medicated, and we know people have seizures. But in the first century, people saw somebody fall down on the ground and start throwing themselves around. What did they think? Demon, right? Because they don't have that school of thought. You see, we often forget that. And God is really good about not arguing science. I'll give you a really good example of that. In the book of Job, if you ever read the book of Job, when Job's talking to God, God says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? That word literally in the Hebrew, when I laid the pillars of the earth. You ever remember reading that? He says, where were you when I laid the pillars of the earth, or the foundations? Translators like to say foundations, but the word is really pillars. Where were you when I laid the pillars of the earth? Why did he say that? Why did God say that to Job? Job thought the earth was round or flat? Flat. And in Old Testament thought, in that time of history, and really up even into Christ, right? How long did people think the earth was flat? When Columbus went to sail, what did they tell him? He was going to what? Going to sail off the edge, right? So God didn't tell Job, he says, where were you when I started the sphere of the earth, right, spinning, right? He says, where were you when I laid, because Job's thought was not that the earth was round. Job's thought was the earth was flat on pillars. That's what they thought. That's what they believed. God never went in there and said, I'm going to give you a science lesson, Job, because it's irrelevant. Whether the earth spins or whether the earth is flat in God's analysis of it, as far as he's talking to Job, that's an irrelevant fact. Doesn't matter, right? Doesn't matter. Makes no difference, because what God's saying is, where were you when I created this earth, right? Where were you when I did that, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that when we read the Bible, we see it very differently. We see it through very scientific eyes. So people try to go back in the Bible, and they try to find Bible things, and they try to say, oh, well, God was talking about a round earth way back in Isaiah. But no. You're missing the point. God never argues that, see? If you notice in the New Testament, you remember when Jesus heals a cripple, and he goes, and they said, you healed on the Sabbath, that was the deal. But you remember what they said? They said, this man forgives sins. And Jesus says, what would it be easier for me to say, right? Take up your bed and walk, or your sins are forgiven. Why did Jesus say that? Because to the Jew, were those things equivalent, do you think? In other words, the paralysis, or the inability of the guy to walk, and the sins of the man, was that equal? Could he not walk because of sin and Jewish thought? Absolutely. What was the cause and effect? You can't walk, therefore, what? You've got sin, right? So in other words, Jesus doesn't argue it, right? Jesus doesn't come in and says, well, let me tell you, this guy's crippled because he's got this disease, and I'm going to cure this disease. Jesus says, what's easier for me? Forgive your sins or take up your bed and walk? See, Jesus doesn't argue the science because it's irrelevant. Because Jesus is saying, either way, I've healed the guy. Whether you can say that I healed him because I healed his sickness, or because I healed his sin. And you see that in James. James says the same thing when he talks about sin. So that sin and illness, sin and blindness, what did he say to the man born blind from birth? He said, who sinned, this man or his parents? It was never, well, this guy's got a medical condition, this guy can't see. That was never the point. That was never the argument. The argument was, who sinned, this man or his parents? The sin's what caused the blindness. Blindness and sin are the same thing, cause and effect. You see what I'm saying? If you're blind, it's because you've got sin. What's the cause? You got sin, so you're blind. Cause and effect, cause and effect. You and I have a whole bunch of causes and effects, you see? We have all kinds of scientific reasons to explain whatever's going on in the world. You understand what I'm saying? And so when we read the Bible, oftentimes we don't see it through first century eyes, because we don't have first century eyes. We're influenced by science. We're influenced by what's around us. And you see that in this story. When this happens and the servant does it and he lives, and when he says, what do they say? Cause and effect. Why did the serpent bite Paul? Because he's getting punished. You see what I'm saying? The cause is not just random. In other words, it's not just because there was a snake in the wood and when it got close. What would we say? What would science say? The snake's hibernating in the wood. When we got the wood close to the fire, snake come around, bit Paul. Right? Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I hear that all the time. People come to me and say, what did I do wrong? I've had people ask me that. I've got all this stuff going on in my life. I got all this suffering. I got all this sickness. You're not sick. I'm sick. Are you better than me? You see? What did you do right and I did wrong? You're right. We still think that way today. We say that. If we have a good day, we say, well, I must be living right. Right? We're expecting that blessing to be immediate. We're expecting God's blessing. And so if I do something wrong, then something bad will happen to me. Right? We think we still, like you say, that's still a reasoning. And I hear that from people. Right? I hear that from people today. I hear that from people a lot. People have a lot of problems in their lives, a lot of medical conditions in their life. When Job had all those problems, his friends showed up and they said, tell us, what do they want Job to tell them? What'd you do? Right? I mean, if you've got all these problems in your life. Uh-huh. Right. Okay, but now Paul's going to live. Right? Yeah, so Paul lives. Yeah. Right. There's a cost for sin, right? There's a price for sin. And that sometimes carries past our conversion. Absolutely. Beyond a doubt. Right. When something really bad happens in your life, one question you inevitably are going to ask is, why me? Right? Probably the best answer. But you're still going to ask that question. Because inevitably, in our mind, we still want a what? You want an explanation. Absolutely. You want to know why. But we're probably better off. But when we want that, we still think there's this great cosmic significance to everything that goes on in our life. Yes. Right. Right. Well, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. The promises. Right. Yeah, that's the agency of man, and that's a big discussion. Theologically, that's a huge discussion. What's man have to do with its own self? What does a man have to do with his own, with the person, his or her, take the pronoun, but salvation, and what does a person have to do with their life, and the idea of sitting back there, and saying, well, God's just going to handle it because He's God is it's kind of a lame thing. God gives us intellect. He gives us ability. He puts people in our lives. Prayer is more than just, to me, prayer is more than just saying, you know, um, God handle it. Prayer is about saying, God, put the people in my life, give me the means, give me the intellect, help me make the right decisions. But, I think there's a lot of things that go on, and I think the Spirit's active among us as Christians, and I think that, so many times we just kind of look for that inherent, well, God's just going to tell him what to do, or God's going to take care of it. And sometimes we need to look beyond and say, what's God putting around me? Who's God going to bring into my life? Let's not cast this stuff aside. Let's, keep God in the mix. But then once again, you start talking about the agency of man. What does man have to do with it? What does God have to do with it? Where do we draw that line? And I think, um, right, and it's a double thing. God definitely put a responsibility upon man. I think Paul makes that really clear. God definitely put a responsibility upon us to do our part. But also we look to God to guide us into those parts. Right. That's right. Yeah, and that's it. Right. Yeah, when you look at what God does for us, the very fact that God gives us what He gives us and gives us a hope, eternity, and gives us, and I think so many times grace surrounds us, but we're kind of like a sailboat in the sea. We never put out our sails and catch the grace. And I think sometimes you gotta, as a Christian, that's kind of our job. We kind of got to catch that grace, and we got to be able to respond to that grace and to understand, like you say, what God has blessed us with. And sometimes we don't do that like we should. Yeah, Jackie. Oh no, I don't think you can pray too much to God for anything. I think as long as your prayer is sincere, it's not just repetition. I don't believe it's like Brent said, and like I've said. I mean, I prayed for my girls to find the right husband until they got married. Until the day they got married. So I don't think you can pray. I think you can pray too little. You know, I really do. I think you can pray. I think you can let stuff go. I think you can. I think if it's important to you, you can pray too little. I think sometimes we forget to pray for those things that we need to be praying for every day, for our safety, the health of our family, the safety of our family. I think there's things we should pray for every single day. Huh? Yeah, that's right. We look for God's will in our lives and for things to happen. And I think prayer is powerful, and I think I see that in my life. I hope you see it in your life, but I don't think prayer is so powerful to me because God just comes down and thumps me on the head and tells me what to do, but because I see when I really pray for something, I see those prayers answered in the people around me and in scripture that I read and in things that I see, and God guides me to those answers, and I think you got to look beyond, uh, yourself sometimes to see God answering your prayers, and I think sometimes we just close ourselves up. It's like the guy on the roof in the flood, the praise for God to save him, and the boat comes and he sends him away, and the other boat comes and the helicopter comes and he sends him away. Says God's going to save me, and he dies and goes to heaven, and he said, God, I asked you to save me. He says, I sent two boats and a helicopter. I mean, it's at some point you've got to, it comes back on you too, to look at what God puts in your life. So yeah, yeah, I think we look for that. We want to, like I say, we want answers. We want to have input. We want to think God thinks like we think, and that's not possible. So what right does the clay to have to the potter, right? Yeah. Huh? What right does the clay have over the potter? And Sam talked about that the other day. Is that yeah? Go ahead, Sam. Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, there's trials that I think God could put upon us, and I think there's trials that the world puts upon us. I think as Christians, God expects us to respond to those in the way that we should. I think Romans 8:28, God causes all things to work together for good for those that love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. And I think that's probably one of my passages I probably cling to more than any other, because Paul never says all things are good, but he does say that God can make good things come out of even tragedy. Yeah, that's right. And until we die, we won't enter His rest. That's when we enter His rest, and that's, I think, comes back to, I forget who said that, but Brent or uh, but the promise here, the promise of God is eternal life. The promise of God is Jesus Christ. And I think when we look for promises from God here, um, beyond that, we're really going beyond what God's told us He's going to do. I think you have to be, we kind of have to have our hope fixated on that. It's like my buddy down in Calera told me when his wife died the other day. He said if every prayer was answered, nobody would ever die. And but we're all going to die, right? So if our hope is in this life only, as Paul would say, we're of all men most miserable. Our hope's got to be beyond this life. Anyway, we didn't get much Acts done, but I had a good time. So love these deep theological thoughts. Hope that helps you a little bit. Sometimes we don't have all the answers, but I think we follow the person who does. That's it. That's